You've come to the right spot. It's another edition of Lewis at Large. 60 minutes of smart talk radio is in your future, with guests from all walks of life and all points of view. And now, with this week's edition of Lewis at Large, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and that of course means another segment of Smart Talk Radio is in your future. This segment certainly no exception. Stephen Harding, he is a longtime journalist specializing in particular in affairs of the military. For nearly 2 decades, he was on the staff of Soldiers, the official magazine of the U.S. Army. He has reported everywhere from the Middle East to Europe and other places. He's currently the senior editor of Military History magazine, author of many articles and books, the most recent of which is a fascinating account of some action at the very end of World War II. It is called The Last Battle, when U.S. and German soldiers joined forces in the waning hours of World War II in Europe. Should be interesting indeed. Stephen, how are you, my friend?
I'm very well, Warner, and I appreciate you having me on.
Good. Before we get down the road too far here, though you live back in the northeast part of the country, I understand you have some very real Kansas roots.
I do, actually. My father was born and raised in Hiawatha, and actually when I was a young soldier, I was stationed at Fort Riley, so I got to see a lot of Kansas.
Yeah, I'll bet you did. Hiawatha, spiritually probably a long way from the D.C. area, I would think.
in more ways than one, Warner.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into this right away. You have written extensively about military operations. This unique combination of U.S. and German soldiers joining forces must have really caught your eye and been intriguing.
Oh, absolutely, from the word go. I first heard about the story, Warner, probably 30 years ago. I was working as a staff historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History in Washington, and an older colleague, an eminent historian named Alfred Beck, had been researching this story, but realized that he wasn't going to be able to follow up on it because of his busy schedule, and he asked me if I wanted the file, and of course I immediately said yes, but then I put it away for 25 years because of family and career moves, and I lived in Europe for 5 years. But it's a fascinating story, and I just couldn't let it go. And then in 2008, I wrote it up as a magazine article for a magazine called World War II, which is put out by the Weider History Group, for whom I now work. And that was very well received, but I also realized there was a lot more to say, and I just could not let this story go. So then I did a lot more research and wrote the book.
Give us, set us up here just a little bit. Again, it's Germans and the U.S. working together. Tell us specifically what was the situation, because it does sound, people have got to be wondering, my gosh, how in the world would that have ever happened?
The basic outline of this, Warner, is that we're talking about the last couple of days of World War II in Europe, specifically May 4th and 5th of 1945. And as you know, by that point, Hitler had been dead for several days. He'd killed himself. The German army was essentially collapsing. Some units were still fighting, some were surrendering, and then you had Waffen-SS, very hardcore units that were not only fighting the advancing Allies, but executing people who were trying to surrender, shooting their own men if they weren't fighting. The story takes place in the part of Austria that's called Tyrol. It's mainly along the valley of the Inn River, which flows out of Switzerland through Austria and then north into Germany. At this point, the American army was advancing, one army was advancing south from Munich and another from the west. The men that I'm writing about were members of the 23rd Tank Battalion. These were the Americans. They were part of the 12th Armored Division, which was in essence leading the entire 7th U.S. Army south from Munich. They had pulled across the border on May 4th and stopped in a little town called Kufstein, which is the first city you really hit once you cross into Austria. And they, like everybody else in the U.S. Army, were expecting that the war was going to end literally within hours. So they sent up some defensive positions and were set to wait. What they didn't know was that a few miles from there is a castle. It's called Castle Itter, or Schloss Itter in Germany. in German. It sits on a ridgeline, and the first fortification on that ridgeline, which overlooks the valley of the Inn River, had been there since the 9th century. And over the centuries, the fortification had grown into a full-blown castle. So when you think of a castle in your mind, Warner, this is the place you're thinking about, with battlements and towers and a front gate. And it's on a very steep spur of land, and you can only reach it by crossing a very narrow bridge, which crosses over a deep ravine. And they didn't realize that this castle was there, and they also didn't realize that inside were 14 French prisoners, very important French prisoners, who had been held there for, in some cases, 2.5 years. Those French prisoners were suddenly in danger because the guards who had been the guard force had evaporated as the Americans advanced. And Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had sent a Waffen SS unit towards the castle specifically to execute the prisoners and their guards. That's the general setup.
I'm curious as to, you're bringing this to light in a very, very detailed, colorful way. Is there a reason why we haven't heard of this before? I mean, the general public?
I think there are a couple of reasons, Warner. The first is, you have to remember that May 4th and 5th, 1945, were just 2 days in a very long war in Europe. The war was winding down. There was a lot of confusion. Not only did you have Germans fighting and surrendering and Americans fighting them, you had the Austrian resistance was involved. You had civilian refugees clogging the roads. And more importantly, there was no focus on this story at the time. It was a very small action. Not a whole lot of people were involved. And any Americans that might have heard about this right after it happened were vastly more interested in the continuing war against the Japanese in the Pacific. Yeah. So it literally just wasn't on people's radar at that time. I'm just curious, as you did research here, was there much about it, or were there people, are there descendants that talk about it? Or is it easy to find if you know where to look, or is this something where you had to do a lot of math and put a lot of different pieces together? It was really a huge research effort, and fortunately, I'm one of those people who I actually enjoy the research part more than I actually enjoy the writing. I was fortunate in a lot of ways. I was able to find a lot of official U.S. Army records that really no one had looked at in 70 years. The official records of the various units involved, which can be very detailed. These are called war diaries or after action reports. I found sort of the same thing for some of the German forces involved. I was able to find the memoirs of the French VIPs that took part in this. But the best part was I was able to track down 3 Americans who'd actually taken part in the action. 2 enlisted guys and an officer, and I was able to interview them extensively. Sadly, since then, one of the gentlemen has died, but the other 2 are alive and doing very well. If you've just joined us, shame on you. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, here again from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, as we are each and every week. In this segment, we're talking to Stephen Harding. He is a military author, expert extraordinaire. He has written extensively over the years about the United States military. The work we're talking about, a good one called The Last Battle. It's about when the U.S. and German soldiers joined forces very briefly over the period of 48 hours in the waning hours of World War II in Europe. Steve, as you talked to these people, was there a sense of one more job to do, weird for them and an alliance with the Germans in this, or was it, again, just sort of another day? Well, I think you have to talk about Jack Lee, the first lieutenant, although he'd actually been promoted to captain but didn't know it yet, the officer who sort of took on this mission. Yeah. He had one point of view, and I think his men probably had a completely different point of view. Jack Lee, at the time this happened, was a 27-year-old tank officer from Norwich, New York. And he was one of those guys, Warner, who'd really found his niche in wartime. He was very good at what he did. He probably, on some level, enjoyed it. It was, the adventure. And quite honestly, he was quite good at killing Germans. His men were also very good tankers, but again, everybody at this point is thinking that the war is over, and nobody wants to be the last guy killed in World War II in Europe. So as Jack Lee and his men are in these defensive positions in this little town of Kufstein in Austria, they see this Kubelwagen, a German military jeep, coming toward them very carefully with an officer in the back waving a white flag. That officer was a German Army Wehrmacht major named Josef Gangl. He went by the nickname Sepp Gangl. And he was coming to ask for American help in securing the castle that contained the French VIPs. Now, Sepp Gangl is a really interesting guy, Warner, because he'd been a soldier even before the Nazis took over in Germany. So he was a professional soldier. As far as we can tell, he was never actually a member of the Nazi Party, but he was a soldier, and that's what he did. He had been decorated for bravery fighting the Russians, and then again for fighting the British right after D-Day. But as he and his men retreated across Germany and into Austria, he reached the conclusion that it wasn't there was no point in fighting for Germany anymore, and he sort of became the de facto commander of another small town called Virgil, which is only a few miles from this Castle Itter. And he actually started helping the Austrian anti-Nazi resistance. He provided them with weapons. He warned them if there were going to be Gestapo or SS roadblocks. And in general, he tried to watch out not only for his men, but also for the people of that town. And in the course of being in command, he found out about these French prisoners, and he realized that they were in extreme danger because, again, at this point in the war, this area of Austria was extremely dangerous. It was kind of like, to use a modern example, it's kind of like Fallujah, but with better scenery.
Right. Okay. What, and again, I don't want to stray too far from the book, but just in general, here's a big, broad, million-foot question for you. What did the United States, in your opinion, learn about itself and maybe learn about its place in the world as a result of World War II?
Well, I think it's World War II that really brought to the world's attention and to the attention of Americans that we are, in fact, a world power, and that we are often called upon to do things that may not be popular at home, but are either absolutely necessary for keeping things stable in areas in which we are concerned, or that sometimes we just can't avoid being drawn into a fight against those nations that are so obviously morally corrupt that to not join that battle would somehow lessen us. I mean, in my opinion.
Yeah. Is there and again, this is, how do you know, and this is rhetorical, obviously, but what, for real, were we, based on the research that you've done, could the Germans have won the war?
That's one of those sort of moving target questions.
Okay.
Because
move with it then.
Well, they could have had the Nazis been allowed to develop a lot of the weapon systems that they were working on, and of course, had they been able to obtain nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Yes, they could seriously have won the war.
Yeah. What about the same thing? Let's ask the same thing with the Japanese.
I don't think so in the same way with the Japanese. The Japanese, at the time they attacked us at Pearl Harbor in 1941, were already sort of overextended. They had invaded China. They were, and just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they invaded Southeast Asia. They really were massively overextended. And in fact, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, most of Japan's leading military leaders realized that they could not defeat us in outright battle without some, slam dunk first shot, which of course Pearl Harbor was.
Well, that's what was going to be my follow-up, was as so many people over the last several decades, the big question is, what were you thinking?
Exactly.
And so anyway, okay. Let's go back again to the book, again, The Last Battle, which we're talking about a 2-day skirmish here where U.S. and German forces kind of aligning themselves. Curious as to any, to your knowledge, connections that those soldiers had later and years later after the war was over.
Well, I know that several of the of the Americans who were involved in this fight stayed in touch after the war. Jack Lee, the man who commanded the Americans, had brought with him on this mission a very good friend, another lieutenant named Harry Bassey. And he and Harry were good friends before the fight, and they remained good friends for years afterwards. They were both decorated for their part in defending this castle and the French people in it. After the war, Harry Bassey, who was a native Californian, went back to California and was a citrus farmer. And actually, much of his land later became what is now Disneyland when the land was bought up. Jack Lee, unfortunately, he, as I had mentioned earlier, I think was one of those guys who really found his niche in World War II, and he didn't do very well in peacetime. He had been a very successful high school and college football player and had hoped to turn that into a professional career. That didn't work out for him, and a habit that he had developed, he was a real cigar chewing, hard drinking, hard charging kind of guy, and he, unfortunately, the drinking part kind of expanded after the war, and his life sort of spiraled out of control. Sadly enough, the two enlisted soldiers that I mentioned earlier, one of them was a member of his tank crew, is alive and well and doing fine now, and the other one, a gentleman named Art Pollock, was a young infantryman who sort of got snagged into going along, and he, I'm happy to say, is also alive and doing well and working 5 days a week in the family business today.
We as Americans here, this is my opinion, but I think I'm close on this. We like hearing stories about the military. We certainly go to movies about the military. A limited number, I think it's a very hardcore, well-educated group that reads about military history in general. From your opinion, again, as a military historian, would our opinions change about either our country, our policies, or our place in the world if they knew more about specific military history?
I think, Warner, that most Americans have only a passing knowledge, as you mentioned,
right,
of this nation's military history. I think if people knew more about the way America has fought its wars and the people who have fought America's wars, I think they would find much to be proud of. I've been in war zones from Bosnia to Iraq, and I was also a soldier myself many years ago. And I think most people, because they don't know how the military operates or how soldiers operate, they don't have a really clear opinion about what we accomplish as a nation or what our military accomplishes. And I think it would be useful for people to know more about that, because there's a lot to be proud of in American military history.
What I'm curious, when you were doing the research for this book, when I would assume you get quite a bit of cooperation from places like the Pentagon and various military museums, is there ever stories that you have done or tales you're trying to tell that you do get resistance?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at that, Warner. When you're in the field as a journalist, say when you're in Iraq or someplace like that, there are public affairs officers whose job is to help you find all the good news stories you want to find. Their job is not necessarily to help you find stories that they would not necessarily want to have publicized. So it's not that they're really trying to obstruct you. It's just, they want to present the better stories to you. As a military historian, there really aren't too many people who obstruct anything, especially if you're writing about World War II. There are still things that are classified for various reasons, but virtually all the records of World War II that most historians would need, unless you're talking about intelligence operations or something like that, have been available for easily the last 20 years. They've been unclassified over time. So it's more the researcher's job to look in the right places and to figure out where those right places are. And really, there isn't any obstruction that I've ever encountered, and I've been doing this a long time, in terms of archival research, unless it's something about an intelligence operation that's classified for some reason.
Well, the story itself, Germans and Americans lining up together, begs itself, of course, the inevitable, well, not inevitable, but possibly either made for or HBO type or big screen movie. Tell us about that.
Well, the book was optioned by an LA-based producer and screenwriter named Bryce Zabel, who has over the years become a good friend of mine. And I was just actually out in LA this past weekend, and very important things are happening in terms of turning this into a film. I'm actually sort of sworn to secrecy about it, but I can tell you that there's huge interest in Hollywood in the story of Castle Litter, because it is such an unusual thing,
Yeah.
Germans and Americans fighting together, plus you have these feisty French people, all of whom, by the way, hated each other and wouldn't even talk to each other in the castle. So yes, there's extreme interest in it, and I, for one, would love to see it turned into a big budget film.
Boy, it really just seems like it's setting it up perfectly. It's a short timeline. It's they can show all these people. Oh boy, I can just see it right now. Everybody coming together, and here we go. All right, so here's the even bigger question: are you going to play anybody in the movie?
That's an excellent question. Not so much me, but my son is actually the star of a fairly popular Hollywood TV show, and so I'm hoping he, at the very least, gets a part.
Oh, really? Can you speak about that, or is that?
Yeah, my son is named Ian Harding, and he is one of the stars of a program called Pretty Little Liars. And I guarantee you, Warner, that you and I are not the demographic the show's aimed at, but it's quite popular.
I am very aware that at my particular age, the demo that the target at me is absolutely nothing close to that, for sure. Anyway, well, this is a fascinating subject, and by a true expert. His name is Stephen Harding. The book, The Last Battle, and it, again, specifically, when the U.S. and German soldiers joined forces in the waning hours of World War II in Europe. It is a fascinating read indeed. It is published by Da Capo Press. Steve, we probably know this, but how can people get a copy of the book? And just as importantly, those interested in military history and the work you've done, how can they find out more about you?
Well, the book, Warner, is available from all the usual outlets, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's both hardcover and ebook. And if people would like to know more about the story, there's a Facebook page. It's facebook.com/Last Battle in Europe. It will give them some photos and some background information on the story. And I think your listeners would, even if they're not into history or even military history, I think they'll find this an interesting read.
Yeah, there's plenty of human interest here for sure. Hey, listen, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us, and would love to have you on again. Real quickly, what's your next work, or are you at that point yet?
Quite honestly, I haven't really thought too much about it. I'm sort of riding this wave at this point. And as you probably know, Warner, writing a book is kind of a long-term process, kind of like having a baby. And I'm not quite there yet, but I'm sure something's coming.
I'll bet it's longer than 9 months, too. But
it is.
Hey, listen, again, thank you so much for being our guest.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.